Of all of the mental illness constructs, oppositional defiant disorder seems to be the one that people are most inclined to ridicule and make fun of. And I can certainly agree with this sentiment. I also find it to be somewhat laughable and ridiculous because it does seem to kind of just pathologize very normal childhood behavior and teenage behavior especially. However, at the end of the day, many people treat this like it's a very real thing. Many educators, parents, school administrators, social workers, mental health professionals, etc. And so it affects real people's lives, and many kids are diagnosed with it. And I think that because it's treated this way, it just becomes something that effectively is real in many different systems and for many different people. And so in this video, I want to share some thoughts on what I think might really be going on here and the implications of that. Just a quick disclaimer here. This video is not mental health advice, and I am not a mental health professional. Also, this video is not intended to be anti-psychiatric diagnosis at all. Many people like their psychiatric diagnosis. Many people find it helpful. And this is, of course, a very nuanced issue and can be very complicated. So this is really just intended to provide some thoughts on the issue that I think have probably been neglected in the conversation. Oppositional defiant disorder is defined as essentially a persistent pattern of oppositional behavior, irritability, and anger to the point where it supposedly severely impairs one's life. But to many, it seems to just kind of pathologize normal teenage and childhood rebelliousness and anger. And I've talked to a few people that buy into oppositional defiant disorder as a real thing. I'll be like, this is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And they're like, no, you don't understand. It's actually real. And they'll say things like, kids are, being oppositional toward them when they're doing something totally innocuous and harmless, like asking them where they want to go to dinner. So I guess that's kind of the basis for how kids start to get labeled with something like oppositional defiant disorder. Now, a couple things stand out to me about this. So the first thing that jumps out at me here, even without considering what might actually be going on with the kid, is just the kind of lack of critical thinking and awareness on the part of the people who buy into this diagnosis and think that it's a real thing. So they see this pattern in a seemingly innocuous context and think that must mean that this is a real illness. But why assume that? And what does it say about us when our default is to jump to that conclusion? What's with the inability to pause, to consider different hypotheses, particularly when it comes to something as consequential as labeling a child with a psychiatric disorder? So I think just that alone tells us that very often the pathologizing and the diagnosing of kids with psychiatric disorders occurs within a context of adults that lack a lot of self-awareness and introspection. And this likely also implies that the adults aren't very good at looking at their own pain, at examining their own wounds. And so this all is the backdrop for kids' behavior and emotional patterns. This is the water that they're swimming in, and all of it is downstream from that. So that's the first point. The second thing, looking more at what might actually really be going on when it comes to the kids here, is around this assumption that the kids have no reason to be oppositional. Well, why assume that? I mean, just because the adults are saying something that seems innocuous doesn't mean that that's all the kids are reacting to, right? We're all communicating so much more than just our statements, right? And often what we're communicating, not with our words, speaks far louder, right? We're communicating with our body language, with our tone of voice, and we can have, very complex very complicated things driving us, really complicated motivations. So maybe, when a parent is telling their kid, what do you want for dinner? They're also communicating potentially, frustration, judgment, contempt, a kind of shaming attitude. I mean, there's a lot of things that they might be communicating. And so the kids might be opposing that, right? They might, even just directly in that situation, they might be opposing all the other things that the adults are communicating. Now, they might also be opposing things that are also going on, not necessarily at that moment, but that aren't being addressed. So that could also be what the kids are opposing. But I think very often this kind of is the source of the conflict between a lot of kids and adults, which is the adults are communicating a lot more than just their words. The kids are feeling that. It's painful, it's uncomfortable. But the adults aren't willing to be accountable. Again, they don't have much, self-awareness and depth. And so this kind of conflict occurs. And it's in that context that the adults are like, wow, see, you have a behavior problem. And this was my experience with most of the adults I encountered, was they weren't very introspective. They weren't, they didn't have a lot of awareness and depth. And they weren't good at showing up with you in a way that was conducive to good relationship. And they weren't and were never going to be accountable for this. Or another thing I remember was there'd often be like this story constructed around certain adults, in particular, like what amazing people they were. Like, wow, they're just so devoted, such amazing people. And, the adults would often compliment each other profusely in this way. And it was really frustrating because my experience of these adults often was really not that. It was often like that these adults could be judgmental and controlling and contemptuous and, were like really unresolved and wounded people in a lot of ways. And so I was responding to that, but then that was basically conflicting with this story that these people loved that made them feel good about themselves. And it was often like in those crucial moments where this narrative that I had behavior problems would get constructed. But really, it was just that the adults were threatened by the fact that I wasn't and couldn't be in denial of my awareness of others, of my awareness of myself, of my awareness of my own feelings, all of which ultimately are good things. And I think this has a lot to do with why the support and the treatment for young people looks the way it does, right? It's why so often, we drug kids to help them, or we send them to mental health treatment that is so painful, like excruciating and traumatizing that it just forces you to dissociate, is because we don't like the real feelings and the true selves of these kids. And so the treatment, so-called, often really is just about kind of forcing them to dissociate, forcing them to disconnect from themselves, because then they fit into environments, social environments that are very, very disconnected, very dysfunctional, and in some cases toxic and abusive. And so a lot of these adults are holding on to a lot of pain, and it is coming through in their energy. And that kind of a social environment is not conducive to children's growth and learning at all. And so all of this is to say that the kids are being oppositional about real and important things. But because it's not being owned, and in fact is being actively denied, and the kids are being actively repressed, their oppositionality may be coming out in displaced ways. Another very real thing that the kids may be opposing is their school environment. It's been said for a long time that kids experience conventional schooling as a kind of a prison. And any way you look at it, it is very authoritarian. And many thinkers have acknowledged this, which is why there's things like Montessori. But kids who find conventional schooling to be oppressive are even remotely assertive about it, are not taken seriously. They're often treated horribly and ridiculed for it. So these kids are opposing real things that the environment wants to reinforce. And so it speaks to a more fundamental disagreement between the kids and the adults. But because the adults have all of the power, they can just basically crush that opposition before they even have to begin to acknowledge what it might be about. Part of the reason why labeling children with something like oppositional defiant disorder is so problematic is because things like oppositionality, disagreeableness, even aggression, while these sound like bad things, they're actually very necessary and very important faculties. And what are they important for? They're important for boundary defense. So somebody whose ability, for example, to be aggressive has been crushed out of them is vulnerable. And what these people are basically doing to kids is they are stealing these very important faculties from them. They're stealing from them these faculties that allow them to be safe and effective in the world. And quite frankly, I think that if we acknowledged or recognized the link between some of the rather nasty and disturbing things that happen to many people when they become adults and this kind of child rearing that is focused on compliance and adjustment, then I think that we would be quite disturbed and we might change our ways. Now, let's just suppose for a minute, for the sake of argument, that this pattern of mindless oppositionality in kids really has nothing to do with the environment. They've done nothing wrong. I don't think that's likely to be the case, but just for the sake of argument, let's assume that. Well, even so, why is it appropriate to look at this as a psychiatric disorder? And what does that do? I've had a million patterns inside of me, a million, emotional patterns and thoughts and things like that are basically just like my own stuff, right? It's my own unfinished business, like every other human being. Every other human being has things like this, things to work through. And, most of us are not really good at that. And often we don't even really have like an awareness that this is something to deal with. We're just so identified with it. It's so automatic. But, I've had a million things like this and I work through them and I look at them. And if I looked at them like they were a disease or something like that, or like a clinical problem, then that would have, first of all, it would have been shame inducing. And it would have prevented me from working through it in a self-directed, empowered way. And the long-term consequences of that would be really unfortunate. And so again, even if these kids just have a problem that's within them, still looking at it as something like oppositional defiant disorder can be quite problematic and quite limiting. So on multiple counts, this construct is highly problematic. And again, I think it just speaks to the larger context that these kids are in. One that doesn't have a lot of wisdom, quite frankly. That where that's not something that's really valued, right? Where there's not a lot of self-awareness and introspection and good and effective communication between people. So that's a really important aspect of the context. So these are my thoughts just briefly here on oppositional defiant disorder. I really hope that you found this video helpful. Please share it with anybody who you think might find it helpful as well. Please also subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Thank you for watching this all the way to the end, and I look forward to having you for the next one.